Good morning. Welcome to Intro to Survey Research. A little coffee. For today, I want to talk about the overview of the class, what my goals are, what the expectations are, what you'll do in the class, and what you'll learn from it. I have three primary goals for the class. First, you'll develop a sophisticated knowledge of sampling and margin of error calculations. These are among the things that are most technical about surveys and most commonly understood. By the time we finish this class, you will know how sampling is done, you will know how to design a sample and various alternative methods of designing it, and you'll know how to calculate the margin of error for your survey and for the design you've implemented. The second major goal of the class is to understand the psychology of the survey response and the implications that has for survey design. The psychology of the response governs how respondents take our survey questions and translate them into a response. Now you might think that's as simple as just answer the question, but in fact there are lots of subtle psychological processes that can affect the validity of survey questions. That has implications for how we word the questions, for the order we present them, and so on. So that in the end of the class you'll also have experience reading and critiquing survey questions and interpreting that in the light of what we know about the psychology of surveys. The third major goal is that by the end of the course you should be able to interpret surveys in the real world, understanding their application, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, and being able to communicate effectively to other people what the findings of a survey are, what it means, what its implications are, but also understanding both what are legitimate criticisms of the survey and perhaps just as importantly, being able to understand what are the illegitimate criticisms of the survey. Doing those together will provide you with an ability to interpret and to mediate between surveys and survey collectors and consumers of surveys. These three goals together, understanding sampling and margin of error, understanding the psychology of the survey response and its implications for survey questionnaire design, and experience with interpreting, understanding, and critiquing actual survey applications in the real world, will give you a significant advantage over other students in the social sciences who have bachelor's degrees but not this particular training. That means that if you're going to be an interpreter of surveys for readers, for clients, for policymakers, for political candidates, this experience of this class will give you a background that few others in your field possess, certainly not when they're coming out of college with a bachelor's degree. If you're a graduate student, the training will improve your understanding of the nature of survey data and make you ready to participate in designing and executing samples for surveys or other data collection projects, and prepare you to design survey instruments of your own to measure attitudes and behavior in your research. In addition, the sampling methods that we talk about, while primarily focused on survey sampling in our case, are equally applicable to sampling from official records, for example, or other kinds of sampling problems that may come up in your research. So there's a double advantage there. Because the sampling methodology and the statistical issues behind it are rather technical, you'll be reading a good bit of statistical articles and chapters about how samples are designed and the statistical properties of these samples. While you can learn much of this material from scratch, it would be helpful if you have a prior course in statistics. If you don't, you can still do this class, but you're going to have to work a little extra hard to catch up on some of the statistical issues. I think through the lectures we'll be able to explain those topics, but there's no question that you're going to have to read some technical material. If you weren't expecting that, you should think about this. Now, within the survey world, sampling is the best understood and the most mathematically rigorous aspect of surveys. Sampling is something that we have theorems about, we have proofs, we know to a certainty how sampling works and why it works the way it does. Unfortunately, sampling is not the only source of variation in survey responses. The other part, which is much studied but not as susceptible to theorems, is the psychology of the survey response. When asked a question, how does the respondent formulate an answer? What are the consequences of that process for the nature and the validity of the responses they give? How did the respondent's characteristics influence the answer that they give? It could be due to the wording of the question, but it could also be due to the order of the questions, or the topics that are being asked about, or even the format of the response options. Survey responses also depend on individual characteristics of the respondent. How hard are respondents willing to think about an answer, or do they simply satisfice with the first thing that comes to mind? If satisficing is common, and research shows that it is, but survey questions are difficult and require active cognitive engagement, then that's likely to affect the quality of the answers that we get. The implication of that is we need to design surveys in ways that engage or encourage more cognitive effort in order to get more valid answers, or we want to ask about questions and behaviors in ways that make them more immediately available to the respondent. In other words, make them better able to retrieve the relevant information. All of that will be covered in the section of the class that deals with the psychology of the survey response. How questions matter is almost as important as how samples are drawn. In some situations, we can estimate something called the total survey error. That part due to sampling on the one hand, and what's due to the interview and the data collection and the psychology effects on the other. It's almost always easier to estimate and control sampling effects than it is to control the psychology and the non-sampling error. And so we'll spend a good bit of time talking about both, and in particular talking about cases where we're able to estimate each separately. Just to jump ahead for a little bit, one of the ways we can do this is in samples that deal with voting and preferences in an election. There it's possible to disentangle the variation across surveys due to sampling variability from that due to other sources of variability, including question wording and something called house effects, the differences from one organization to the other. By being able to estimate total survey error, for example, we can show that sampling variability accounts for maybe 4% or 3.5% of a margin of error, but that the additional sources of variability may add another 1.5 or 2 points. So the total survey error may be plus or minus 5%, even though the sampling error alone is only plus or minus about 3%. By being able to disentangle these two sources of variability, we're able to say more realistically how accurate are surveys.